The power play, a test of character in the corporate world. The silent rules of corporate power. In the towering skyscrapers of the financial world, power isn't just about who makes the most money or who controls the biggest accounts. It's about perception. Who gets acknowledged, who gets ignored. Ethan Carter, a sharp, analytical mind with years of experience in finance, had spent his career proving himself in a system that often overlooked people like him. Talent, numbers, and results were supposed to be the only things that mattered. But the corporate world doesn't always play fair. And on this particular day, he was about to experience that firsthand. A meeting that was supposed to change everything. The morning sun reflected off the gleaming glass walls of Orion Capital, casting long shadows across the sleek, modern offices. It was the day of the most critical quarterly meeting, the kind that could make or break careers. Ethan walked into the high-powered conference room, armed with meticulously prepared reports, ready to present insights that could shape the company's financial future. He was prepared. He was confident. But as he reached out to shake hands with Victoria Langley, the CEO of Orion Capital, something unexpected happened. She ignored him, twice. The handshake that never happened. At first, Ethan thought maybe she didn't see him. It happens. People get distracted. But then, she greeted every other executive in the room, shaking hands with them effortlessly. Except for him. The message was clear. Crossmark, you don't belong. Crossmark, you are not one of us. Crossmark, you will not be acknowledged. Ethan felt the weight of that dismissal in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't just a handshake. It was a power play. And in that moment, he had a choice. Keycap 1, let it go and play the game the way it's always been played. Keycap 2, stand his ground and demand respect. He chose the second option. Steady, controlled, he spoke, his voice carrying through the room. Miss Langley, I extended my hand, twice. May I ask why I was ignored? The room fell silent. Some executives exchanged nervous glances. Others suddenly found their notes very interesting. Victoria turned back to him, her lips curling into a cold, knowing smirk. Oh, Carter, she said, voice dripping with condescension. Must everything be about race with you? A sharp, cutting silence filled the air. Ethan felt the heat rise in his chest. He had seen this tactic before, the attempt to shift blame, to make him seem overly sensitive, to paint him as the problem. This wasn't about race. This was about respect. But she had just twisted the narrative. A calculated move. Victoria wasn't just ignoring Ethan out of habit or mistake. She was testing him. Would he back down? Would he sit down and accept the unspoken rule that certain people are just meant to be seen but not acknowledged? Or would he call it out? He had made his choice. That's not what I said, Ethan responded, keeping his voice controlled, but firm. I asked a simple question, but Victoria had already won that round. She laughed lightly, brushing off the confrontation like it was nothing. And before Ethan could push further, another executive, Richard DeWitt, the CEO, stepped in, awkwardly clapping his hands together. All right, let's focus. We have investors waiting. The meeting resumed. But for Ethan, everything had changed. Because this wasn't over. The aftermath, a new battle begins. Ethan sat through the rest of the meeting with perfect composure. His reports were flawless. His insights were sharp. But none of that mattered. Because at the end of the meeting, Victoria turned to him and said 6 words that would set the next stage of the fight in motion. Carter, my office. Now. It wasn't a request. It was an order. A few executives exchanged knowing looks, their expressions unreadable. Was this it? Was this the moment where she would try to break him? Ethan didn't hesitate. He stood up, adjusted his suit, and walked toward the lion's den. But what happened in that office? That was something no one could have predicted. Because this wasn't just about a handshake anymore. It was about power. It was about control. And most of all, it was about the moment where Ethan had to decide if he was willing to risk everything. The breaking point, when power is challenged. Inside the lion's den, Ethan Carter walked into Victoria Langley's office with steady steps. But inside, his mind was racing. This wasn't just a private conversation. It was a battle of control. The office was a fortress of power, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, a desk that seemed more like a command center than a workspace, and a CEO who sat behind it like a queen deciding the fate of her subjects. Victoria didn't even look up when he entered. She let him stand there, waiting, letting the silence stretch, a classic intimidation tactic. Finally, she looked up, eyes cold and calculating. "Do you enjoy making a spectacle of yourself, Carter?" she asked, her voice smooth but sharp. Ethan didn't flinch. "I don't see it that way, ma'am," he replied. "I asked a simple question." Victoria tilted her head slightly. "You made it a spectacle." Then, without warning, she slid a document across the desk toward him. "But fine," she continued. "If you want something to actually be upset about, let's talk about this." Ethan glanced down. His stomach tightened. It was a 20% salary cut. Effective immediately. The power play more than just a pay cut. Ethan's hands curled around the edges of the paper. A pay cut wasn't just about money. It was a message. Crossmark, you don't belong here. Crossmark, you're replaceable. Crossmark, if you step out of line, you pay the price. And she wasn't stopping there. Victoria pulled out another folder and placed it on the desk. "And since you seem so eager to lead," she said smoothly, "I have a task for you." Ethan didn't touch the folder. He just looked at her, waiting. "I need you to inform all foreign employees in your department that their salaries have been adjusted as well," she said. "Adjusted?" Ethan asked, voice controlled. "You mean reduced?" Victoria smirked. "Words are subjective, Carter. But if you insist, yes, their salaries are being reduced. And you're going to tell them." A slow, controlled anger began to burn in Ethan's chest. This wasn't just about him. She was targeting an entire group of employees, knowing they had fewer options to fight back. And she wanted him to be the one to deliver the news, to make him complicit, to make him one of them. Ethan exhaled slowly. Then he reached for the folder. For a split second, Victoria's smirk widened. She thought she had won. Then he spoke. "I'll get it done," he said. His tone was even. But inside, his decision was already made. He wasn't going to break. He was going to fight. And Victoria Langley had just given him the perfect reason to start. The ripple effect, when one man stands up. Ethan walked through the halls of Orion Capital, the folder clutched tightly in his hand. His heartbeat was steady, but there was a storm raging beneath his skin. Victoria thought she was making an example out of him. She thought he would do what every ambitious professional was expected to do. Nod, swallow his pride, and carry out the order. She thought wrong. The first person he went to was Carlos Rivera, a financial analyst who had been with Orion Capital for 5 years. Carlos took the document, read it, and went pale. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. Ethan didn't respond. He just moved to the next person. Melinjo, a senior strategist. Adeola Okafor, one of the company's top investment advisors. One by one, he handed out the notices. And one by one, he watched the same emotions play across their faces. Shock, anger, disbelief. Until finally, someone asked the question he had been waiting for. "Why us?" Ethan met their gazes. "Because Victoria Langley doesn't see us as equals." The words hung in the air. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Adeola leaned forward. "So what's your move?" Ethan exhaled. "We don't take this quietly," he said. "We make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of leader she really is." And just like that, the silent rebellion had begun. The unraveling power shifts when people unite. By lunchtime, the whispers had spread through the office. By 3 p.m., employees were no longer whispering. The financial department, usually a quiet, controlled space, was now charged with tension. People weren't working. They were watching, waiting for someone to make the first move. Then Ethan stood up. One by one, others followed. A silent, deliberate procession made its way through the corridors, past the glass-walled conference rooms, past the executives who stiffened in their seats, past assistants who grabbed their phones to report what they were seeing. By the time they reached Victoria Langley's office, The entire executive floor had gone quiet. Ethan didn't knock. He didn't ask for permission. He opened the door and walked inside. The standoff, when fear is no longer an option. Victoria was waiting. She didn't look surprised. She let her gaze sweep across the crowd standing behind Ethan, then back to him. And then she smiled. "Well, this is dramatic," she mused. Ethan didn't waste time. "We're not working," he said, voice steady. "Not until this policy is reversed." Victoria exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "Carter," she sighed, "I'm not sure where you got the idea that you're in charge here, but let me remind you, Ethan cut her off. "No," he said, "let me remind you." The air shifted. This wasn't the same conversation as before. This wasn't Ethan asking for respect. This was him taking it. "If you fire us," Adeola spoke up, "you'll have to explain to the board why you cut salaries for foreign employees and then terminated them when they refused to accept it. Explain to investors why Orion Capital is making national headlines for discrimination," Malin added. Victoria's expression flickered. For the first time, she was calculating the risk. She had power. Immense power. But even she wasn't untouchable. A long, sharp silence stretched across the room. Then Victoria leaned forward, her voice dropping to ice. "Carter, you just made a very, very big mistake." Ethan held her gaze. And for the first time since this battle began, he allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile. "No," he said quietly. "You did." The final move when power faces consequences. The air inside Orion Capital's executive floor was thick with tension. Victoria Langley, the undisputed ruler of this corporate empire, sat behind her desk, fingers tapping lazily against the polished surface. Ethan Carter, the man she had underestimated, stood firm, surrounded by his colleagues. This wasn't just a salary dispute anymore. This was a reckoning. And for the first time in her career, Victoria wasn't the one holding all the cards. The turning point when the game changes. A long, suffocating silence stretched between them. Then Victoria leaned back in her chair, studying Ethan with amusement. "You really think you can strong-arm me into reversing a financial decision?" she asked, her voice smooth, calculated. Ethan didn't blink. "No," he said. "We're not asking." Behind him, his colleagues stood firm. Crossmark, they weren't negotiating. Crossmark, they weren't pleading. White heavy checkmark, they were demanding justice. For the first time, Victoria's smirk faltered. The unexpected arrival, a higher power steps in. Before she could respond, the door swung open. Jonathan Price, one of Orion Capital's senior board members, walked in. His presence commanded attention instantly. Even Victoria, for all her unshakable confidence, tilted her head slightly in acknowledgement. "What exactly is going on here?" Jonathan asked, his voice even, measured. The tension in the room shifted. For the first time, Victoria wasn't the only one in charge. The truth revealed, a corporate experiment. Victoria exhaled lightly, then did something unexpected. She smiled. A slow, knowing smile. Then she turned to Jonathan and said, "Why don't you tell them?" Jonathan sighed, then faced the employees. This was a test. A ripple of confusion moved through the group. Ethan's jaw tightened. "A test?" he repeated, voice controlled. Jonathan nodded. "We've been looking for a leader, someone who not only understands this company's mechanics but has the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the stakes are high." The room was dead silent. This wasn't about money. This wasn't about Victoria's power trip. This was about finding someone who was willing to fight even when the system pushed back. Victoria's smile widened. "Congratulations, Carter," she said. "You passed." The aftermath, the power shift. Ethan stood motionless, processing everything. The manipulation. The manufactured conflict. The deliberate test of character. Behind him, his colleagues reacted with mixed emotions. Pouting-faced Carlos muttered in disbelief. Astonished-faced Malin let out a breathless laugh. Thinking-faced Adeola nodded as if he had started to suspect it. Ethan's hands clenched at his sides. "So you put us through this just to see how I'd react?" Victoria shrugged, unapologetic. "Leaders don't rise in comfort, Carter." Jonathan stepped forward. "Effective immediately, you will assume the role of Vice President of Corporate Strategy," he said. "You earned it." The weight of the words settled onto Ethan's shoulders. This was what he had fought for. But it wasn't just about him anymore. The final decision, leadership redefined. Ethan glanced at his colleagues. The people who had stood beside him when he had no guarantee of victory. The people who had risked their jobs because they refused to accept injustice. Then he turned back to Victoria. "If I take this position," he said slowly, "the salary cuts are reversed. For everyone." A flicker of something unreadable passed through Victoria's expression. Then she smirked. "Negotiating already?" she mused. Ethan didn't flinch. I'm not negotiating, he said. I'm leading. Jonathan chuckled under his breath. Victoria tilted her head. Then, after a moment, she gave a slow, approving nod. Done. The final handshake, a new beginning. Victoria stood, smoothing out the fabric of her blazer. I suppose this is the part where I shake your hand, she said. Ethan exhaled sharply, the tension in his chest finally loosening just slightly. This time, when he extended his hand, Victoria took it. And just like that, the game changed. The lesson, what the story teaches us. This wasn't just a corporate power struggle. This was about how leadership is truly defined. Lightbulb lesson 1, respect isn't given. It's earned. Ethan didn't demand respect with words, he proved he deserved it through action. Lightbulb lesson 2, the strongest leaders don't just protect themselves, they uplift others. He could have accepted the promotion and walked away. But he fought for his team too. Lightbulb lesson 3, power only works if people let it control them. Victoria tested him by putting pressure on him. But instead of breaking, he thrived. Real leaders aren't the ones who climb alone. They're the ones who pull others up with them. Final call to action, your turn. Speech balloon, what do you think? Have you ever faced an unfair situation at work? Would you have taken the job if you were in Ethan's place? Fire like this video if you believe leadership is about standing up for what's right. Loudspeaker, share this story to inspire others. They'll subscribe for more powerful lessons like this. Rock it, because sometimes the only way to change the system is to challenge it.